All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the accounts of a figure who, no matter how you look at it, completely changed the course of history, Jesus of Nazareth. Whether you're coming at these texts from a place of deep personal faith, sheer historical curiosity, or just a love of ancient literature, there's no denying the massive impact of these narratives. We're going to trace this chronologically. We'll start small, with a really intimate, human-scale childhood story from the Gospel of Luke, and then pan all the way out to the vast, almost encyclopedic records of his adult miracles. Basically, we're looking at what the texts actually say, how different traditions recorded the exact same events, and how modern scholars make sense of it all today.
So, here's our roadmap for today. First up, the boy in the temple. Then we'll break down the categories of the miracles, check out some miracles beyond the Bible, and wrap up with interpreting the extraordinary.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, the boy in the temple, straight out of Luke chapter 2. Picture the scene. A massive festival in Jerusalem just wrapped up and Jesus' parents start the long trek back home. It actually takes them a full day of traveling before it hits them. They literally left their 12-year-old behind. I mean, you can only imagine the sheer heart-dropping panic, right? They frantically search among their relatives, find absolutely nothing, and have to trek all the way back to the city. It takes 3 agonizing days of searching before they finally spot him. And where is he? Sitting right there in the temple courts, totally calm, hanging out with the teachers, asking questions, and basically confounding everyone with his profound understanding. So, when his mom, Mary, finally gets to him, she's understandably shocked. She asks him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you everywhere." And his response? It's incredibly striking. He just looks at them and says, "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" Now, the text actually notes that his parents didn't quite grasp what he meant at the time, but looking back, it's this huge, pivotal moment where he's declaring his identity really early on in the narrative. After that wild sequence, Luke just gives us this really simple concluding thought. He notes that Jesus goes back to Nazareth, is obedient to his parents, and grows in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man. It's just a single sentence, but it totally bridges the gap. It takes us right from that 12-year-old boy in the temple to the grown man whose adult ministry, filled with deeply intertwined words and literally extraordinary works, was about to echo across the entire ancient world. Which brings us right to Section 2, categories of the miracles. As his reputation exploded, the texts start recording a massive array of miracles. And to really wrap our heads around the sheer scope of his adult ministry, it helps to organize these deeds. They generally fall into 4 distinct pillars. First, you've got cures and healings, which is definitely the biggest chunk. Then exorcisms of demonic spirits. Third, we see the truly profound resurrections of the dead. And finally, acts showing perfect harmony with nature, basically exerting absolute control over the natural elements. And the variety within these 4 pillars is just wild. For cures, you have super intimate moments, like a bleeding woman who is healed simply by brushing against his cloak. But then you also have these intense, dramatic scenes where guys literally tear open a roof just to lower their paralyzed friend down to him. For exorcisms, there's that famous wild account of him casting a whole legion of demons out of a man and right into a herd of pigs that go rushing into a lake. Then, for resurrections, you've got the incredibly personal story of him raising his close friend Lazarus, who had already been dead for 4 whole days. And as for nature, the accounts range from calming a violent, raging storm at sea, all the way to turning water into the absolute best wine at a wedding in Cana, which actually kicked off his whole public ministry. Now, all of these accounts eventually cemented a really central theological concept for traditional Christianity. It's called the hypostatic union. Basically, it's the idea that he was 100% human and 100% divine at the exact same time. Believers point to texts showing him getting hungry or exhausted or ultimately dying as rock-solid proof of his humanity, but in the very same breath, they look at these 4 miracle categories, healing the sick, casting out demons, raising the dead, and commanding the weather, as absolute proof of his complete divinity. To traditional Christians, these aren't just flashy magic tricks. They're seen as profound acts of divine compassion for a suffering world. Moving on to Section 3. Miracles beyond the Bible. It's actually a huge misconception that these kinds of extraordinary accounts only exist inside the standard canonical New Testament. They totally don't. The stories ripple out into a ton of other historical texts. Take the infancy Gospels, for example. These are 2nd century texts totally focused on narrating Jesus performing miracles when he was just a kid, filling in the gaps of his early life.
The infancy gospel of Thomas, for instance, expands his childhood universe with some really surprising stuff. It talks about the young Jesus making little birds out of mud and bringing them to life, miraculously stretching out a piece of wood for carpentry, and even carrying water entirely perfectly inside his cloak.
And the fascination doesn't stop there. Multiple major world religions independently document and revere him as a miracle worker. In Islam, the Quran explicitly talks about Jesus healing lepers, curing the blind, and yep, even mentions that same childhood story about forming birds from clay and breathing life into them. Over in the Book of Mormon, there's a whole account of him miraculously descending from heaven to heal the lame, blind, and afflicted. And if you dig into more obscure, fragmentary texts like the apocryphal Egerton Gospel, you'll find miracles that aren't in the canonical texts at all, like Jesus standing by the Jordan River and causing fruit plants to just spontaneously ripen out of nowhere.
Let's head into our final part, Section 4, Interpreting the Extraordinary.
When we step back from the ancient texts themselves and look at how people understand them today, we hit a massive crossroads. On one hand, you have the traditional Christian view, taking these as literal, historical events that prove ultimate divine power and deep compassion. But on the other side, non-religious and scholarly views analyze the exact same texts through a totally different lens. They look at the ancient Hellenistic culture, a time when gods and philosophers were often credited with healing powers, and suggest these stories might just be mythical narrative devices. Or they propose they could be actual psychosomatic cures, sparked by the powerful suggestion of a highly charismatic leader.
If we zoom in on the academic and philosophical side, the variety of opinions is just fascinating. You've got liberal Christianity, which often reads these miracles strictly as metaphors for moral teachings rather than literal events. Then there's the famous Scottish philosopher David Hume, who essentially argued, look, human testimony for miracles is inherently unreliable. End of story. Historian Will Durant thought the healings were simply the natural result of a super-confident spirit acting on really impressionable people. And then groups like the Jesus Seminar argue that, yeah, Jesus was likely known as a healer, but they chalk it up to naturalistic placebo effects. But here's the crazy part. Despite all this debate over exactly how it happened, the broad consensus among scholars is that his actual contemporaries genuinely believed he was doing the impossible.
I think New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman hits the nail on the head regarding the historian's dilemma here. He points out that a historian's whole job is to figure out what probably happened based on the surviving sources. So, by their very definition, miracles which literally violate the natural order are always going to be the least probable explanation if you're strictly using historical methods. Because of those limitations, historians simply can't definitively prove or disprove these events. They have to step back and leave the supernatural stuff entirely to the realms of faith and theology.
And that leaves us with this incredible, massive cultural footprint to ponder. Regardless of what you personally believe, whether you see these stories as undeniable divine truth, fascinating ancient myths, or just a deep historical mystery, you absolutely cannot deny their impact. How is it that these ancient, dusty accounts of a brilliant young boy in a temple and a man who supposedly commanded the wind and the waves managed to so completely shape the entire course of world history and human literature? Well, I hope this explainer has sparked your curiosity to dive in and explore these incredible texts for yourself.